finally managed to find a publisher when a publisher that only issues Japanese fiction appear. So that gives you an idea.
Go back to one other question related to this. When you retranslate, at what point? I'm interested to hear what challenges you face in doing that. But one of the things that always strikes me is, when do you bring in the other versions? Do you ever look at the past versions? Do you look at them before you get started? Do you figure out, well, this is going to be a really tricky spot, I want to see how other people have accomplished it? How do you interact with that?
At this point, my feeling, I've come to this through a long route, but my feeling is, if I don't look at at the other translations, I'm the only person in the room who hasn't. Because all the critics have, all the readers have, everybody else has looked at it, the translator hasn't. This makes no sense, to be the least informed person in the room. And I think that people who talk about being, they're afraid of being influenced, or just saying, oh, I'll just do what they did, or not. I think those people don't have strong opinions and don't have enough experience to really have a sense of what this voice sounds like. It's not that you won't, you'll find translations where everybody decided on the same thing. Even translators who don't like each other or don't agree with each other in other ways. Certain things are obvious. But I think once you learn how to finally hear the voice of that author in your head, you're going to have a pretty firm idea of what you want to do. There's a man named Tim Sergey who teaches now at Albany, SUNY Albany. He's a wonderful, wonderful Russian translator. He's one of those people who I'd read something in a magazine, I'd say, this is a great translation, and 9 times out of 10 be him. He's a brilliant translator. And he also talks about translation a lot, and he said that retranslations, particularly of these very, very famous books, are almost like a dialogue among the translators. You get Anna Karenina 12 times. You've got almost a dialogue going between them. And it's almost like a separate conversation, sort of a meta conversation about the work.
Do you find it liberating in any ways? Because it seems like I've only done a retranslation once, and I did find that knowing that somebody else had already done it this way made it possible to try something else, to try and bring out different aspects of the text.
Isn't that the whole point of retranslating, that it is to make a difference? Of course, if your translation is going to be the same, you don't retranslate. So the intentionality is always there from the very beginning, which I think is one of the interesting things. The self-consciousness about retranslating is you're recreating different values. Are they your values or the publishers, or?
Sometimes that's true. You'd be surprised how many retranslations are done because of faults, really definite faults in the original. Either there's been a new definitive edition of the original text. Now, in Russian, I don't know how often this happens in other languages, but certainly the new Oblomov I did is the only one from what's considered the definitive edition. And that's one of the reasons we did it, because nobody had done that translation. And it's actually just an improvement over what exists. Pearl one doesn't use it. Another recent translation uses an older edition of the original. So a new original edition is one reason. Another reason is, people didn't used to take translations so damn seriously. And they came to the hard bits and they sort of moved on. I can't tell you how many older translations I've looked at, and you get to this part and you're looking at the Russian and the English and you say, but where's this part here? White Guard definitely is an instance of that. White Guard was, which just came out, is a book that is so likable and so wonderful. It's in a Michael Glenny translation. Michael Glenny translated a million things. He's a fabulous writer, but he had kind of different standards, and this is an extremely intricate book stylistically, and he blew that off. He wrote a great book, but it wasn't exactly what Bulgakov had written. So that's another reason. So they're faults. I would say mostly it's faults. With A Hero of Our Time, one of the big things was that Nabokov did not believe in translating verse as verse. So you'd have these gorgeous poems. Lermontov was a fabulous poet, and they're nothing in the English. I mean, they're just sort of, I don't know, they're not that interesting. They're not poetry. So to make those poems, or in Envy, there's a lot of comic verse, and nobody had made them comic. This seems to be a basic, if you're looking at what the intention of your translation is to produce an effect ultimately and to create a response in the reader. So I would say most of the translations I've done have been because there's deficiencies in the existing translations. Not always, but
rather than to, I don't know, modernize the language or change
and
the
that's another
register.
reason. Well, that's an interesting thing about the Russian classics because people are always dissing Constance Garnett. I'm actually a huge supporter of Constance Garnett because what they're seeing, they say, "Oh, it sounds like you're in English country garden." Well, when she was writing in essentially a very neutral language. And it had a transparency at the time, and that transparency lasted for quite a while. But now we're reading it through that language. Now that's not transparent, it's opaque, and we have to deal with her language. So it's an intervening writer, definitely, with someone like Garnett. So there is dating, a certain amount of dating goes on, which is something I'm going to talk about in Professor Gibbons' class tomorrow. Unlike Japanese, which, as I understand, is one of the fastest changing languages in the world. I mean, that you can hardly read things written 100 years ago. I mean, it's not like modern Japanese, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Russian, because it's such a conservative society, I don't know why. I postulate that because of the Soviet period being so conservative, the language didn't change very much. You read 19th century Russian, it's not that different from literary 20th century Russian. In 100 years, it sounds very modern. So that's kind of an interesting fact, what you do with that.
So I'm going to switch for a second and ask Michael you a couple questions, because there are a few issues that you kind of touched on that are going to come up here. But first of all, how did you end up translating Kawabata's book as an undergraduate?
Yeah, maybe I'll kind of start from the more general question, which is how did I start translating, which is to kind of keep this line going. Sometimes you're walking down the street and you come to a stoplight and you stop. You start to smell something. And you think, that's not my shoe, is it? And you look at the bottom of your shoe, and sure enough, at some point you stepped in something. So that's basically how I got into translation. And I kind of wonder if there's, probably everybody has a similar kind of story. I remember when I was a freshman, I just started it was my first semester studying Japanese. The professor, and I was going to be an English major, I decided, because I figured there was no way I would be able to learn to read Japanese in 4 years. One of the professors of one of the English classes I was taking said, "So what do you want to be when you get out of college? What do you want to do?" And I said, "I would like to be a literary translator." And her response was, "How heroic." And I didn't really know what she meant by that then. So that tells you, at some point, right, I decided I wanted to be a literary translator. And I think it actually goes back just basically, it's fairly simple, actually. I always liked to read. I always liked to write. And I decided that I wanted to study Japanese. I remember that definitely by the time I was in 6th grade, I wanted to study Japanese. Of course, at the time I didn't know the difference between Japanese and Chinese and Korean and probably Arabic. They were all just sort of languages that were very, very far away from me. And my sister is also a translator of modern Greek. And when we were very young, we had a dream that we would one day be able to speak 7 languages, so that we could speak a different language every day of the week. And we stuck with that dream for about a week, I think, until we realized that my parents only speak English, so we'd only be able to speak to them